They say prison has a smell. It does. It's the stench of sweat, fear, and disinfectant failing to mask years of human misery. That's what I was inhaling as the heavy, reinforced door slammed shut behind me. I was no stranger to adrenaline. The nightclub business comes with its share of late nights and bad decisions. But this wasn't adrenaline. This was survival, raw and unfiltered. I shouldn't have been there. At least that's what I told myself as I stood in line, naked as the day I was born, waiting for some bored guard to bark orders at me. My name was called, and I bent over for inspection like every other inmate in that cold, fluorescent-lit room. "You'll get used to it," one of the younger guys mumbled as we shuffled down the hall. He looked about 19, a face full of pimples, eyes too wide for someone who claimed he'd killed a man. Maybe he had. Maybe we all had. I was in for shooting a guy, defending myself after he and his buddies turned my nightclub into a war zone. The cops didn't care about the context. They just saw a bleeding body and my gun. That was enough. And now I was here, thrown into the deep end of the justice system, with a max security label slapped on my file. The first few weeks were a haze of monotony. My cellmate at the time was a wiry guy doing time for assaulting a guard. We barely spoke, which suited me fine. When he was transferred, I was left alone in the cell. That silence was the closest thing to peace I'd had since my arrest, but it didn't last. The first night I heard screaming. It was distant, muffled by the thick concrete walls. The sound clawed its way down the corridor, a high-pitched, frantic wail that sent a chill through the block. "Help! He's trying to kill me!" It went on for minutes, punctuated by the sound of bodies slamming into metal and the shouts of guards. When it finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the noise. Rumors spread fast the next day. A guy had been attacked in his cell, his face smashed into the toilet until the guards dragged him out. The attacker? A hulking man everyone called Big John, who'd been in and out of solitary more times than anyone could count. I didn't see Big John until a week later. He was in the day room, sitting alone at a table, his massive frame filling the space like a shadow. He had to be at least 6'5", built like a brick wall with arms the size of tree trunks. His face was a mask of indifference, but there was something about him that made the air feel heavier. People kept their distance. Even the loudmouths, the young guys who puffed out their chests and acted like they owned the place, stayed far away. He didn't look at anyone directly, but you could feel his presence from across the room. I tried not to look, but I thought his eyes followed me whenever I moved. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival instinct. He gave me the creeps, and I didn't want to find out why. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of boots stomping down the corridor. 2 guards stopped outside my cell, their flashlights cutting through the dark. "Get up," one of them barked. "What's going on?" I asked, sitting up. "You're moving," the other guard said flatly. "Moving? Where?" "Don't ask questions, just grab your stuff." I stood there for a moment, my stomach twisting as I processed what they were saying. Then it hit me. There was only one empty cell in the block. "Wait," I blurted out. "You're not putting me with him, are you?" The guards exchanged a look but said nothing. "Look," I stammered, desperate to come up with something. "I shot a black guy. I don't think this is a good idea." It wasn't entirely true, but I was grasping at anything that might get me out of this. The guards paused, muttered something under their breath, and then turned back to me. "Stay here," one of them said. They locked the door and walked off, leaving me standing in the dark. I dodged a bullet, but the relief didn't last. The next morning, I heard they'd moved someone else into Big John's cell. For weeks, I avoided him. I kept my head down, stayed out of the day room as much as I could, and made sure never to cross his path. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had me on his list. I caught glimpses of him here and there, his massive frame looming in the corner of my vision, his expression unreadable. Then one morning, Block was buzzing with whispers. "Did you hear? Big John killed his cellmate last night." The details were gruesome. They said he'd snapped the guy's neck during an argument. The body left slumped on the bunk until the guards found it during roll call. I sat in my cell, staring at the wall, my mind racing. It could have been me. If I hadn't spoken up that night, I might have been the one lying dead in that cell. From that point on, I avoided him at all costs. I didn't need a reminder of how close I'd come to being his next victim. In prison, survival isn't just about strength, it's about luck. And for once, mine held out. But even now, years later, I can't forget the way he looked at me, like he was already measuring me up. That's the thing about prison. You don't have to be the strongest or the smartest. You just have to survive long enough to get out. When I first got to Black Ridge Penitentiary, everyone told me to keep my head down. Do your time and stay out of people's business, they said. And I tried. God, I tried. But in a place like this, trouble has a way of finding you no matter how much you want to avoid it. My name's Marcus. I got 5 years for aggravated assault, though I swear it wasn't as bad as it sounds. My lawyer told me Black Ridge wasn't the worst place I could end up, but stepping inside that yard for the first time felt like walking into hell. Gangs controlled everything: the food, the contraband, the jobs. You had to pick a side, or you were on your own. And being on your own in here was dangerous. I'd been in for about 6 months when he arrived. Ethan Carter. Skinny guy, mid-30s, with pale skin and brown hair that always looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. He didn't look like much, a nobody. But there was something about him that immediately drew people in. He had this way of smiling that made you think he was harmless, like he could be your friend. Ethan showed up on a Tuesday morning, and by lunch, he'd already sat with one of the smaller crews at their table, laughing and sharing his food. By the next day, he was playing cards with the Mexicans in the yard. A week later, he was hanging with Big Ronnie's crew, the shot callers in Black Ridge. No one makes friends that fast in here. No one. It takes months, sometimes years, to earn trust. But Ethan, it was like he had a cheat code. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I wasn't in a crew, so I wasn't part of that world. I worked in the laundry, kept to myself, and stayed out of trouble. But then Ethan started talking to me. "You're Marcus, right?" he said one afternoon in the yard. He had this friendly, disarming tone like we'd been buddies for years. "Yeah," I replied, wary. "I hear you're good with numbers. They got you keeping track of the laundry inventory, right?" "Something like that." "I could use a guy like you," he said, flashing that easy smile. "Someone who knows how to keep things organized." I didn't know what he was talking about, and honestly, I didn't want to know. "I'm good, man. Thanks." But Ethan didn't take no for an answer. Over the next few weeks, he kept finding ways to pull me into conversations. He'd ask about my family, my life outside. He had this way of making you feel seen, like you mattered. Eventually, I started to let my guard down. That's when things started to get weird. One night, I was lying on my bunk when my cellmate, Terrence, walked in. He was clutching his side, blood soaking through his shirt. "What the hell happened?" I asked, jumping up to help him. "Knife," he grunted. "Bathroom. One of Big Ronnie's guys." I didn't ask questions. I just helped patch him up. But the next day, Terrence told me he'd been set up. Someone had tipped off Big Ronnie's crew that Terrence was stealing from them, which wasn't true. "They're gonna come for me again," he said, his voice shaking. Later that day, I saw Ethan laughing with Big Ronnie in the yard. And that's when it clicked. Ethan had been the one to rat Terrence out. He was playing both sides, pitting people against each other. I confronted him about it. "What's your deal, man? Why are you messing with people like this?" He just smiled that same damn smile. "You don't get it, Marcus. This place is a chessboard. I'm just moving the pieces." A few weeks later, the tension in Black Ridge hit a boiling point. Two of the main gangs were at each other's throats, and violence was breaking out almost daily. Somehow, Ethan always seemed to be nearby when things went down, whispering in someone's ear, passing along a message. One night, I was working late in the laundry when Ethan walked in. "I need a favor," he said, tossing a bundle of clothes on the table. "What kind of favor?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "I need you to deliver a note to Big Ronnie," he said. I stared at him. "Why me?" "Because you're invisible, Marcus. No one pays attention to you. You're perfect for this." I didn't want to do it, but refusing Ethan felt dangerous. So I took the note and handed it off to Big Ronnie during breakfast the next morning. He read it, nodded, and then said, "Tell Ethan it's done." That night, an inmate was stabbed to death in the showers. I started watching Ethan more closely after that. He had his fingers in everything: contraband, gambling, even the guards. He was like a spider sitting in the center of a web, pulling strings no one else could see. But what really scared me was the way people trusted him. They didn't see the manipulation, the lies. To them, he was just a nice guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. One day, I overheard a conversation between two guards. "That Carter guy," one of them said. "He's been giving us intel, real useful stuff." That's when I realized the truth. Ethan wasn't just another inmate. He was working for the administration. Maybe he was an informant, or maybe he'd cut a deal to reduce his sentence. Whatever the case, he was using everyone around him to climb the ladder. The violence escalated. Fights broke out daily, and the guards started cracking down hard. Entire blocks were put on lockdown. Through it all, Ethan thrived. One night, during a particularly chaotic lockdown, I found a note under my pillow. It was from Ethan. It read, "Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. Don't take it personally." That same night, the guards raided my cell. They found a shiv taped under my bed, a shiv I'd never seen before. I was dragged to solitary confinement, where I spent 2 weeks in total isolation. When I finally got out, Ethan was waiting for me in the yard, smiling like nothing had happened. "You set me up," I said. "It was necessary," he replied calmly. "But look on the bright side, you're still alive." I wanted to kill him right then and there, but I knew that's what he wanted. He thrived on chaos, on watching people destroy themselves. A month later, Ethan disappeared. One day he was in the yard, the next he was gone. No one knew where he went, and the guards refused to answer questions. Some said he'd been transferred, others whispered that he'd been silenced by the administration. To this day, I don't know the truth. But every time I think about him, that chilling smile and the way he manipulated everyone around him, it sends a shiver down my spine. Ethan wasn't just dangerous. He was the kind of evil that hides in plain sight. And the scariest part? People like him don't just exist in prisons. They're out there, walking among us. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. I had been in the system long enough to know how it worked, but nothing had prepared me for the kind of violence that bubbled up in the dormitory that night. I'd spent years in solitary confinement, and when they finally let me back into general population, I thought I could handle it. I had no idea what I was getting into. I was assigned to a lower-tier dorm in a medium-security prison, the kind of place where people did their time quietly, avoiding trouble when they could. But there was a dark undercurrent running through the block, one that simmered just beneath the surface. I could see it in the way the inmates looked at each other, the tightness in their shoulders, the way every word felt like it was carefully measured. I kept my head down, sticking to my own business. That was how I survived back in solitary, and that was how I was going to make it here too. No one bothered me, and I didn't bother anyone. That was the plan. But plans always had a way of falling apart in this place. It started with a loud argument in the mess hall one evening. A couple of guys were shouting at each other across the table, both of them flaring up over something small. A comment about food or who got the last roll of toilet paper. I couldn't even tell. It didn't matter. It was just the spark, the kind of stupid thing that would set the whole dorm off. I sat back in my chair, trying to blend into the background, but it wasn't long before others started circling around. Their eyes were glued to the argument, like they were waiting for something. A fight. A brawl. It didn't take long before the first punch landed. The guy in the white jumpsuit went down hard, his face slamming against the table with a sickening crack. I didn't want any part of it. I had learned long ago that when chaos erupted, you didn't get involved unless you had no other choice. I stayed seated, barely breathing, watching as the fight spread like wildfire. But then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed my shoulder. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't a tap. It was a firm grip, like the person was trying to pull me into something. I turned, ready to tell the guy to back off, but I found myself staring into the eyes of a man I didn't recognize. He was older, his face hardened with years of prison life, but his eyes had that unsettling calmness that made my blood run cold. He didn't say a word, but his hand was still on my shoulder, squeezing tighter, like he was waiting for me to move. I wasn't the kind of guy who looked for trouble, but I had learned not to ignore a threat. "Let go of me," I muttered, low enough that only he could hear. I didn't want to make a scene, but I wasn't about to be anyone's pawn either. He didn't budge. Instead, he looked at me, and his lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "You think you're going to sit this one out?" he asked, his voice so calm it was almost soothing. "There's no such thing as sitting out around here. You're either in or you're dead." I could feel my pulse pick up, but I didn't let it show. I wasn't going to be some scared rookie in a prison full of sharks. I had my own demons to face. "Get off me," I repeated, this time a little firmer. I didn't wait for him to respond. I shook his hand off my shoulder, stood up, and turned to walk away. But as soon as I moved, someone else grabbed me. Another inmate, taller, broader, his arms like steel cables. "You're with us now," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't know who these guys were, but it didn't matter. I wasn't getting involved in whatever power struggle was going on. I had learned long ago that you didn't need to make friends in prison, but you definitely needed to avoid enemies. I turned back around and tried to push through them, but that's when the fight reached its peak. A chair slammed into the back of my head, sending me crashing to the floor. I barely caught myself before my face hit the concrete. That was when the real fight began. The air was thick with shouting and violence. People were everywhere, swinging punches, throwing chairs, kicking. The sound of flesh hitting flesh filled the room, the chaos overwhelming. And in the middle of it, I was dragged into the fray, whether I liked it or not. I swung back instinctively, trying to get some space between myself and the two guys who were holding me. One of them caught a fist to the jaw, and I immediately took advantage of the opening, landing a hit to the side of his head. He staggered back, but before I could do anything else, the second guy rushed in, his arms locking around me in a chokehold. I fought back, pushing my body weight against him, trying to break free. But the more I struggled, the tighter he squeezed. I could hear the ragged breathing in my ears, feel the sweat pooling between my shoulder blades, my body pushed to the limit. Something inside me snapped. I didn't care anymore. The rules, the plan, I forgot about all of it. I fought like I had nothing left to lose. My fist connected with the guy's ribs, and I heard the sharp exhale of air leave his lungs. He loosened his grip just enough for me to break free. I shoved him off me, and that's when I saw the first guy, the one who had grabbed me by the shoulder earlier, coming at me again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I took him down with a hard punch to the face, following up with a knee to the stomach that left him gasping for air. The noise around me faded into the background. I was in it now, part of the fight, part of the violence. There was no backing out, no turning back. By the time the guards rushed in, shouting orders and banging their batons on the floor, the fight had already been won. I wasn't the victor. Hell, I wasn't even sure who won. But in that moment, I realized something. In here, there were no rules, and there was only one way out of it: survival. When they pulled us apart, I was bruised and bleeding, but I was alive. And that's all that mattered.